Why, hello folks, old Buster coming to you again with another story. This one's called Showdown. We got it in chapters, so I'll be going through that, chapter 1 through whatever it is, and give you a little chance to kind of cipher on that. Well, Showdown, chapter 1. Well, Jesse jumped down to where Hired was laying and waited for the big cat. Well, after Jesse hunkered beside Hired, he asked Hired how he reckoned this was going to play out. Hired told Jesse to keep an eye peeled from east to west, and he'd keep a lookout from west to east. Hired figured the big cat would make a move for a kill real soon. The Bengal tiger would run hard to this here thicket and hadn't had time to water or feed, so he'd be on them pretty soon with the blood bait fresh on the goat that was staked out in front of him. Jesse said this was sure a hair-raising time just waiting for the big cat to attack. He said his nerves was sure enough frazzled. Both the boys were real quiet-like, waiting like they was, and didn't expect what happened next. Well, Hired heard the paws of the tiger dig into the ground through the leaves and dead grass as he sprang forwards to the boys. With claws extended and teeth bared, the body could just smell the stench of death on the big cat. Well, Hired and Jesse figured the big cat would come for the goat from the north where the beaters and the dogs cornered him in a thicket. So choked with briars it was where a rabbit couldn't run, but the big cat outfoxed the boys. He circled the boys and come in from the south and didn't go for the blood-baited goat, but for the boys instead. Well, Hired always had a way with him when it come to any kind of animal. It was like a sixth sense he was born with. Hired turned just as the tiger sprang on him and fired his .404 Jeffrey. Click! It misfired. Well, Hired knowed in a split second that he was a goner. There was no way he was going to survive the attack from a Bengal tiger hell-bent on killing him. In the meantime, Jesse rolled to his and right but couldn't aim as the action was just too fast and furious. He just ups and points his 350 grain .458 lot towards the cat and pulls the trigger. They was both darn lucky, I'm a-telling you. The hate on that tiger was pert near plumb just took off by the round. It was so powerful. Jesse's shot found its mark by the grace of God, 'cause he sure didn't plan it that way. Well, the old tiger landed mostly on Hired, and Jesse got a few claw marks from the right paws that landed on him. Nothing serious, but the battle scars always be a conversation piece for sure. Now, as Hired crawled out from under the critter, he was just a-grinning. He said to Jesse if he could recollect exactly how all this come about. Well, Jesse said he dang sure could, and he wasn't going to forget it neither. Oh boy. Whilst Hired and Jesse sat there waiting on the boys from the Al G. Kelly Miller Brothers Circus to get to him, he said, "Now Jesse, just think back for a spell and tell me that this is something that was sure enough in the cards or not." Well, back when us boys first met up with Mr. Obert Miller, it was the thrill of a lifetime of being with them and knowing them all these years. Back in them days, our little town couldn't afford no big name circus. The Miller brothers had us on their route, and we was lucky to even see them. Well, remember, when Buster won that money at Soup Spool Hall, we all chipped in for the families to go see the circus, and us boys helped out setting up the circus. Keeping in touch with our friends all these years come to be a real blessing of knowing mighty fine folk. Being from Hugo, Oklahoma, and all made it all the better seeing as how they wasn't all that far away. Now don't you go a-saying us helping them out wasn't a good thing neither now. Just think of all that happiness those folks brung to people all these years. Well, Jesse said he didn't regret it none, but it sure scared the fool out of him when that tiger come for him. Who would have thought that big cat was that smart to sneak up on him from behind like that? Well, Hired said he ought to have figured on it, but just didn't allow that it would go that way. But all's well that ends well. I surely hated to kill that cat, but it went rogue and it had to be done, to be put down. This tiger done killed 4 young'uns and injured 9 more when he jumped the fence at that daycare. That was sure pitiful. Mr. Miller said he was a new cat that come from another circus, and he just didn't know why he went rogue unless he was mistreated awful bad. Of Of course, they don't train their animals that way, but it was a crying out loud shame all the way around. To tell the truth, I'm glad it was me that tracked the critter and us putting him down, said Howard. It sure was a funny feeling I had about that cat before he jumped on me. I'm awful proud you saved my bacon too, Jesse. Jesse said it was just dumb luck and he was a-coming for him as well. Well, Howard told Jesse how it was with tigers and how endangered they was, and then he give Jesse a rundown on them, hunting them up and guns to boot from articles written by experienced hunters. Well, Jesse had an earful from Howard, about these animals and guns and whatnot. He's bad as Big Mike Young with them guns. He says it seems like fellers know what they're talking about after he told him all that, said Jesse to Howard. I'm just hoping I don't have to know any of it in the future. But they had to. Well, Howard just howled and slapped Jesse on the back and told him they had to hit the road, time's a-wasting. Well, Chapter 2. Howard and Jesse got caught up in this mess of hunting down a man-eating tiger whilst on a business trip. Howard was going with Jesse to complete a deal on some new technology for fuel cells and a revolutionary motor he was investing in for the boys. They stopped over in New Roads, Louisiana, where the circus was playing a date to see the Millers and the circus folks they had been friends with for many years when the tiger escaped. Well, Howard volunteered him and Jesse to help out killing or catching him. Of course, Howard knowed they had to put the tiger down since he done wreaked such havoc on them youngins. Now that all that mess was over with, him and Jesse headed on out to Montgomery, Alabama to finish up the deal. Jesse said this was going to be a real moneymaker for him. Jesse was a dealing in high finance in the world markets and was the only one that really had a handle on the portfolio for the boys and their interests. They left it all up to him. Of course, they know a little something about it, but they just let him handle it. He done good in that area. They was looking at over $1 trillion of equity and could trade up to 15 times that amount. $15 trillion was a lot of clout in this old world, and the biggest supporter of the boys was Mr. Holmes, even though he's a little long in the tooth. Well, Jesse had made sure that BB and Alfred, Devane, Dalton, and Hiram and Horace was took care of whether they knowed it or not. The boys always took care of their friends and their people and families. Wasn't none of the boys' friends going to do without if they had a dime in their pocket, I'm here to tell you. And anybody in need, they always took care of. Remember old Goober Uber, on the backside of the mountain, big young, feldspar mine, and his wood wheel bicycle? That boys took care of, never knew what was going on. But he was a good boy. But anyhow, I don't want to get off another story. Of course, Jesse took care of the Four Winds Foundation they had established for all manner of charity work, and each of the boys had certain charities that they donated to that was real special to them. Buster said the Holy Spirit directed each one of them in that regard, and that's a fact. All the glory was given to God for what all he had blessed them with, including good health. The boys had good families, good wives, and good friends. Well, after the meeting in Montgomery, Jesse called Walter and Buster and wanted to set up a working vacation in Europe and Australia. It was a fur piece, but a little fun along the way was something they all needed. Well, Jesse had done learned to give enough time for everything instead of just work. Between the boys and Monique, Jesse got the drift and was right proud he seed the light. That boy just worked night and day. He just always up about business and lawyer. He was living the dream now. Buster was attending his and Lulu's pet project of a green subdivision. That's where, everything's kind of like off the grid and not using any fossil fuel and whatnot. They done that in Idaho, and Walter was investing in a process to be used in their gold mining claim to New Mexico, and Howard was doing some flight training with the Navy Top Gun set up by Mr. Holmes, so him and Monique went on out to New York for 3 days long with her mom. Well, Jesse had some business on Wall Street, and the women folk was going to do some shopping. Well, Jesse said he had to take care of this mite of business before they left out to Europe and Australia. There was one slight change in the plans when Louis Chang called and wanted them to stop over for a day or two and see the place after the houses had been built for the boys on Exuma. That's them bamboo houses. Well, a hurricane take down a blockhouse for it, or a hurricane taking down a bamboo house, and they're beautiful things too. Buster found them dang things. Well, Jesse made a heck of a deal on 94 acres and made sure it offered every amenity possible for the boys and their families and friends. Now, Louis lived on Grand Bahama Island and took care of things for the boys whilst they was gone. Louis and Buster went way back, and the boys and him was in all kind of business deals all over the globe. You know, Buster was a big scuba diver, and that's how he met old Louis when he owned a scuba diving shop. Xanadu's the name of it. Jesse flew the Queen into LaGuardia and had a limo pick him up and take him to the St. Regis Hotel. Well, Jesse's meeting began at 9 a.m. the next morning, and him and the women had an afternoon to go him around, which he did, just following, looking at everything, which he just dearly loved to do. Well, that evening they had supper catered to their room and then went to a Broadway musical called Oklahoma. All in all, they had a dandy old time. Now, the women folk had plans for shopping and dinner, whilst Jesse would be tied up for the day, but planned on supper with them and one of his lawyers, Bulldog Henson. Old Bulldog was quite the feller, straight as an arrow and all for gun rights, the Second Amendment. He owned every which kind of gun and had a small arsenal. Even though he was a little Yankee-fied, he was Texican through and through. Him and Walter was big buds, but him and Howard shot guns from daylight to dark. Bulldog was a smart one, I tell you. He knowed the law inside out. Of course, to get Jesse's blessing, he had to be darn good, and he was. That's why he got paid the big bucks. The boys give him a heck of a Christmas present that he had been a-yearning for since the day they all met him. It was a Barrett 416, $28,000 worth of shooting iron. That boy was tickled plumb pink and wanted to take it out and shoot it right then and there, but in Yankee land there just ain't nowhere to shoot the thing. Bulldog had to get on over to Buster's farm before he got to shoot the darn gun. Man, oh man, would it rattle your teeth and deefen a feller. Buster had an old wrecked car he let Bulldog shoot up, and when he got done, there wasn't a place on that car that didn't have a bullet hole in it. Well, after supper, they was all walking back to the hotel, and all of a sudden, Monique fell out in the street with a bus bearing down on her. Well, Jesse just happened to be looking her way during his conversation with Bulldog and lit a shuck and pulled Monique out of the path of the bus just as it passed by. She was skun up a mite, but otherwise okay. They was right close to the hotel, and they had a doctor on call, and Jesse had her examined by him. Monique said there was somebody that pushed her into the street. Well, Jesse asked her if it was an accident, and she said she didn't know. She was all right. That was the main thing. Well, the next 2 days was uneventful, and all of them had a really good time. Well, Bulldog flew back with them to meet up with the boys and discuss the meeting in New York. Whilst Bulldog was there, all of them agreed to take the Duchess to Europe, and then on to Exuma, and then on to Australia. Jesse said he wanted to know if and they wanted to bring Charlie and Steve in on this deal. Well, all the boys voted yes. They sure would make a good team along with Butch Skelton. Shelton, I mean. Get him wrong, they'd shoot me, wouldn't he? He was a young'un, but a real fireball. So Buster called up, and all of them got to talking and told them they wanted to go with them. And this here trip, along with their wives, Caroline and Sandra Jean. Now, Butch was going to leave old Winston home along with Jesse's Chihuahua Annabelle and Lulu's 2 cats, Fatty and Nuthead. This wasn't going to be a trip for critters, that's for sure. Well, they all would probably be eat right off the bat, and then squalling and carrying, and would be here for a month. Best to leave them with family or the pet hotel. Heck, that place was better than where they was a-staying, pricier too. Well, Bulldog and Butch was single, so they didn't have no women folk to bother with. But the boys and Steve and Charlie sure enough did. Buster put Butch to earning his and keep to find things to occupy their time while they was in meetings. Well, we didn't think that was going to be a problem nohow, because they going to shop and gom around and talk and whatnot. Them 6 women was sure enough having the time of their life, I tell you. Old Butch outdid his himself and had them women occupied from daylight to dark. He even hired a personal guide to take them any place else they figured on going. Well, London was their first stop, and the meeting with the bankers went pretty good, except they was trying to take the boys out the game. Well, nothing overt, mind you, but all the men folk could see the handwriting on the wall. Now, the boys all knowed about the Rothschilds and their underhanded dealings and figured they was up to no good with these here fellers. There was a flat-out offer to buy out all their holdings for a hefty profit, but all the boys had to agree to never get back in the global financial world again. Well, that wasn't going to happen, that's for sure. The boys had more reasons than money to do what they was a-doing, I'm a-telling you, and Mr. Hiram Holmes was involved in that with the Presidential Corps, and then the economy and health of the world, not just what they were doing and the few bucks they had in their back pocket or in the bank. Well, on the way back from Country Manor, one of the bankers where a meeting was held, Buster had a light bulb come on. He told Jesse to pull up the private equity portfolio of Four Winds. There had been something nagging at his brain ever since that computer programmer of the bankers was showing them the statistics of their hedge fund. Now, Buster told the boys that there was something bugging him about all that, and he just couldn't put his finger on it right then. As Jesse brought up the files, he handed the laptop over to Buster. Buster immediately went into the programming of the files. Now, Walter and Hired was just plumb bumfuzzled amazed with their tongues lolling and gagging and their eyes bugged out. "Where in the world did you learn all that?" said Buster, exclaimed Walter. "Hired said we never knowed you could do computing." "Well, it was what I learned in the Air Corps," declared Buster. Jesse was just a-grinning and said, "You boys thought he was just another pretty face, didn't you?" and went to caterwauling. "You mean to tell us you knowed he could do that?" Walter said to Jesse. "Well, yep, I did. Just wasn't no need of talking about it at all." Well, Buster said, "Looky here, boys, I think I got her figured out. It's a combination of the old field data code and an 8-digit code. Somebody has been cooking the books, boys. They've hacked our system. This stuff ain't been used for years. It's from the days of paper tape, military." "Well, that takes a cake. Now we got some military peckerwood a-messing with our books," said Walter. "Well, looks that way," said Jesse, "but I'm sure he has a Boss Summers up the food chain. Let's keep this close to the vest and see how it all plays out." About that time, a 18-wheeler, a lorry they call it over in England, hit them and run them off into the ditch where they rolled over 3 times. When the limo come to rest, Buster was a-hollering if and everybody was all right. Now, the driver was deader than a dadgum mackerel. Butch had a goose egg on his and Haid, and Bulldog had 2 broke fingers. Well, Bulldog said he was sure glad it weren't his and trigger finger. Well, the rest of the boys was skun up some, except Buster and Walter whomper-jawed their bad knees. They'd be all right with a shot and some eye soap. Well, Jesse said, "This is getting right interesting, boys." He told them about what all happened in New York with him saving Monique. A lot of them decided to call Mr. Holmes and give him the lowdown on what was happening. Well, these boys had been too many adventures and seen too many things not to know this wasn't up to par. Well, after talking to Mr. Holmes and promised to keep him advised, they all left on out to Switzerland. Well, Chapter 3, Geneva, Switzerland. It was only 460 miles from London, so it didn't take long to get there on the Duchess. Well, Hired flew her into Cointrin Airport, and a limo met them and took them to the Royal Penthouse Suite at the President Wilson Hotel. Now, all the group would stay in that 18,000 square foot 10-room suite with 7 bathrooms. Boy, that's a big one, ain't it? It had ultra security, including bulletproof glass and a private elevator. There was more than enough room for everybody, and the $65,000 price tag for the night was worth every penny to keep the folks safe. There was only going to be there, for one night anyhow, and supper'd be catered and in the suite. And they could order anything they want, you know. Well, all the women folk would be in the spa and resting up during the day, and they was leaving after the morning meeting the next day anyhow. When Jesse and the boys got to the Pictet and C Bank, they was met by Mark Pictet and the managing partners and their representatives. Well, whilst they was waiting, they read up on that bank and found that It was founded in 1805 and was one of Switzerland's largest private banks. And they had assets under management of somewhere like $384 billion. But anyway, from the outset, Pictet & C had focused solely on managing the wealth of private and institutional investors. It didn't engage in any form of investment banking, and it didn't issue any commercial mortgage or unsecured loans. Well, the reason we're talking about this is all going to come pretty clear here in a little bit. Well, they had a partnership that was managed by 8 partners who stood personally and entirely liable for the bank's commitments. And these 8 partners included some real twitchy fellers now. As such, the bank enjoys total independence and controls the entire chain of its operation and does not need the approval of shareholders in making decisions. And a lot of this is very important because these folks do what they want to, and I just bet you can figure out what's coming, and it's called the Illuminati. Well, anyhow, coffee and refreshments were served up to the boys, and then they got down to the nut cutting. Now, these here Peckerwoods wanted all the gold held in safekeeping in their Four Winds Bank and all the gold mined in the future from their claims and mines. They was going to give the boys a deal they couldn't refuse, it looked like, whispered Walter to Jesse. Well, all the boys and Bulldog just eyeballed them fellers and asked what all they was to get in return. $1 trillion apiece, said some feller at the end of the table. Well, Jesse said he sure appreciated the offer, but Four Winds wasn't for sale. The feller at the end of the table said they would sell to him or end up with nothing. Woo, that made the hair come up and hackles on the back of old Buster's neck, and the rest of the boys too, for that matter. Well, Buster jumped and said, "You don't say," says Buster to the feller and the rest of the bunch. "I just don't reckon you can do too much about it now, can you?" Well, the feller at the end of the table was bald as a goose egg and told Buster that he would rue the day if he didn't do as he was told. Well, now that got Buster's dander up, I'm a-telling you. Them hackles of Buster was a higher than a tush hose. Buster went for that bald-headed feller with fire in his eyes. And Baldy run around the table, but that didn't cause no concern with Buster. Buster grabbed that 600-pound conference table and turned it over on all of them. All the fellers on the other side, too, and would send them a-running. Them little sandwiches and donuts and coffee went a-flying. Woo! Walter and Hire and Jesse grabbed a hold of Buster, and it was all they could do to hold him off of that bald-headed feller. The head knocker said there weren't no truck with him and told the boys to leave on out. Now, Buster was madder than a wet hen and hollered to them all, them yahoos, that he didn't take kindly to them threats and to make like a frog and jump. Well, that was that, and the boys and Bulldog went on back to the hotel. Well, Jesse had done his homework. He done found out about the ties to the Rothschilds. In April of 2007, the Fitch Ratings Agency, whoever they were, gave him this rating of AM2 and to Rothschild & C Gestion for its collective institutional management as well as multi-management. Ain't that a mouthful? Them Illuminatis, they all in it again. On the way back, Jesse said there was sure enough evidence of their old enemies. That Illuminati was on the prowl again. Now, Mr. Holmes needed to be called as soon as they got back to the hotel. Howard said if Rothschild was involved, it surely was a pack of trouble at their doorstep. Well, Charlie and Steve was helping out with Butch to see that the Duchess was serviced and the women folk packed up and ready to go. First, Mr. Holmes was called and brought up to speed on what all happened, and said he would advise the boys whilst they was in the air, what all he found out. Well, Howard filed a flight plan and they took off for Exuma. Their business was done in Switzerland, leastways they thought it was. Chapter 4. The route to Exuma went by way of Agadir, Morocco, where they was met by Abdul, the king's cousin. You know, he got shot that time when they was in that deal, them Muslimators. He was an old friend from the mission they fought a while back. Walter had radioed to Haid to tell Abdul they was going to stay over in Agadir for a couple of days and would like to see him if he had the time. Well, sir, Abdul met the boys and their friends with a band and a parade. Well, Jesse run like a scalded dog, but he was hugged up by Buster and had to take all the carrying on and celebrate. Jesse wasn't much for the limelight, you know. Well, Charlie and Caroline and Steve and Sandra June ain't never been to these here parts, and in fact, to none of the places they've been up to now. They was in hog heaven and having a humdinger of a time. The onlyest cloud over the trip was the run-in and the accidents that happened. That wasn't good. But these here was dear friends of the boys, and they made hay whilst they could of having a good time. Well, all the group had a big old feast with Abdul and his people and some of the fellers they had fought with and got to know the last time they was here. Well, the next day Abdul and the women folk had a day trip planned and shopping and sightseeing. Well, after 2 days' rest, Walter and Buster fired up the Duchess with Walter in the left seat. They said their goodbyes and give their good wishes to the king by way of Abdul and left on out to Exuma. King told him he was in some other meetings and going to be out of the country, and he wished he could be there to see them boys. See them next time around. Buster and Jesse had taken over the controls by that time and landed at Exuma International Airport and headed on out to the Peace and Plenty, a favorite spot of Jesse's. Louis met them there the next morning and took them all out to the 94-acre Jesse bought for them. The houses was just gorgeous, the gal said. Now Maisie, Louis' wife, come along with him and took the gals to lunch at 10 a.m. but didn't get back to 4:30 p.m. that evening. Now they had one of them liquid lunches too now. Don't believe they didn't. They talk about something going on and talk about a long lunch. These gals had a snootful and a giggling like they was teenagers. Well, all the men folk agreed it was a good thing they was having a good time and put all the mess out of their minds for a spell that happened over in Europe. Well, everybody was getting a tan and eating and drinking plenty and just relaxing and getting rid of all the worries and woes. They stayed a week there at the Peace and Plenty, but took day trips to the other islands with Louis and their guide. Of course, y'all remember later on, Jesse and the boys bought the Peace and Plenty, and they had it for all their friends to stay as well as the bamboo houses. Now, Louis knowed how Buster loved his dumplings and made up a passel of them for him and the group one evening in Buster and Lulu's new house. All the wives of the boys were tickled pink with their new houses and went to a buying and making list of what all they wanted to put in them. Now, Louis and Maisie had done a bang-up job for the most part, and them 4 houses of the boys was a sight to see. Everything was king size in Buster's house, from the turlet to the bed. Now, Walter's house was pretty near the same as Buster's, but his in bed was too hard, according to Buster. Well, Jesse and Monique sure enough had a flair to it, with her being Cajun and all, and hired Alma Mays was Western-like. Now, each one of the houses was 6,000 square foot, so that they had enough room for friends. Well, Jesse also said he was planning their own clubhouse and a guest house for each one of the boys, so they could have their people staying behind them too and have their own place and not feel all crowded up. Also, since they now owned the Peace and Plenty, like I was telling you a while ago, he was having it updated and remodeled for when they had more people than room in for a shindig and all. Now, Maisie had a passel of gals she knowed that was single, and Bulldog and Butch fixed up on that in no time flat. Them boys rightly cottoned to them gals, and after the first couple of days with everybody, Bulldog and Butch took off on their own for a spell, doing a little sporting and courting and going on. These gals sure knowed how to have a good time, and Butch and Bulldog was on a non-stop party. The casinos opened their doors for them, and, well, let's see here. Them gals they was with, because they knew them all, and because of, well, I guess it was Louis' connections with the port and all, you know, when they was trying to do that over there. I'm trying to get all this straight in my head, trying to, explainify what's going on. Sometimes I get carried away. And anyway, they went to the casinos and they put them in where they had private gambling or people in the VIP treatment, that kind of stuff. And even old Butch won a few dollars there. The gals had a feller to take them on a moonlight cruise around the island one evening, but round about 10 p.m. that evening, one of the Bahamian police officers come to Jesse and told him there was big trouble. There had been an accident. Butch was in a coma, and Bulldog was broke up something fierce. That boy must have put up a tussle, I tell you. 'cause there was a couple of fellers that was in the morgue. One of the gals was dead as well. Well, it was plumb pitiful the way it was described to the boys. Bulldog, Butch, and the gals was a-romancing in the moonlight, the captain said, when a speedboat full of pirates boarded them and went to work on Bulldog and Butch. Well, first off, the captain said, a bruiser of a feller backhanded the gal that was with Bulldog and knocked her colder than a wedge with teeth a-flying. There was 8 of the pirates, and an errant round they shot off hit the gal Butch was with and killed her. Well, Butch wasn't very big, you know, but that dog had some fight in him. They just plumb beat Butch down with all manner of clubs and rifle butts. Bulldog tore into them fellers like a buzzsaw, but they tackled him and held him down and broke every bone they could with a ball bat. Well, the captain was cornered, and one of the pirates was about to shoot him when the captain shot him with a flare gun. Now, that was about the time a boatload of folks come up to see if they could help, and the pirates took off pronto with the feller he shot with the flare gun. Now, 3 of the pirates held the folks on the boat at bay till they could get away. It was awful what they done to them boys, and said the captain. Now, Howard questioned the captain if he'd heard or seen anything that would help catch the pirates. Well, nothing much, but there was one thing he heard when they was a-beating Bulldog. The big bruiser said a funny thing to Bulldog. He said, "This'll teach you to do what you're told, Buster." Woo-wee, that hit the boys like a ton of bricks. The boys all looked at each other and thought back to their meeting with the bankers in Switzerland, especially that bald-headed feller. Buster uttered one word: Illuminati. The attack ended their vacation right then and there. They was in a war again. Mr. Holmes was contacted immediately and told what all happened and what the captain said. They mistook Bulldog Henson for Buster and Butch Shelton for Jesse. Well, this was a warning that went bad in the killing of the gal. The group had a meeting late that night after talking to Mr. Holmes. And Mr. Holmes was going to see to it that Bulldog and Butch was airlifted back to the States as soon as possible. Also, he was making sure Monique's mama got back to the bayou where she'd be safe too. Well, Jesse asked if Charlie and Steve and the women wanted to go back home or not. Well, they all said no and said they was going to continue on to Australia with them. In that case, said Buster, with the other boys nodding in agreement, we need to leave out now to Australia. Well, Mr. Holmes will have agents on the ground if them Peckerwoods try anything there. With that being said, they headed for the Duchess. The Duchess was well provisioned. This is chapter 5. She was prepared for anything that come down the pike, including guns and ammunition, armament, clothing, survival gear for any climate, food and medical supplies, plus all manner of odds and ends and knickknacks. The Duchess had been updated with a hush kit that made her ultra quiet and an increased payload to 191,000 pounds. With all the folks you could pile in her, plus their luggage, she wouldn't even breathe hard. Her range would normally be about 2,400 nautical miles, but that was increased with extra fuel tanks to 5,800 nautical miles to let her fly across in the ocean. Well, Buster and Jesse took the first turn of flying and planned to stop in Cayenne, French Guiana to visit Harry's bar whilst refueling the Duchess. Well, Walter sure enough had a tale to tell. Charlie, Caroline, and Sandra June. They was plumb hornswoggled at what all the boys had been in and been doing and been through. They just couldn't believe the boys ain't told them about all their adventures and rambling. Well, Buster told them they ain't heard the half of it, and one day they'd have to confab a storytelling. After a bit of refreshment and topping off the tanks of the Duchess, they lit out for Lusaka, Zambia. Well, Buster radioed ahead to Dhaka, and when they landed there was a band and motorcade waiting for them. Lord have mercy, when Jesse stepped off of that plane, old Dhaka met him right off, and the general of the Zambian army saluted Jesse and said, "Welcome home, Captain." Boy, that got him. Jesse, he just couldn't hardly stand it. Turned red around the ears and everything. Well, that about done it for Charlie and Caroline. Steve and Sandra June whispered into Howard's ear, wanting to know what all they'd been into here. Oh, the motorcade went to the palace where they was greeted by the president and his staff. Handshaking and huggums was going all around, and all the group was showed to their rooms. A grand state dinner was held in their honor that evening with not a monkey in sight. Oh, when all of them got together later on that evening, questions was a-coming fast and furious from the gals. I'm a-telling you, Captain, what's this all about, Jesse? Well, Buster, what's this all about catching some feller? Walter, you and Howard are in this too about some kind of fighting. Now give, said Sandra June. Well, she's the one that's sure enough curious, so the story had to be told. Charlie and Steve said they wished they'd been there to help them too. Caroline said the president's wife told her how much you boys helped their people and the changes y'all helped bring about. Now, ain't y'all something a gallivanting around not telling us the whole story? Said Sandra June. Monique nor Lula didn't even know about all this, Jesse said to Sandra June. Now fess up and tell the story. Well, it was after 1 a.m. in the morning when all the jawing was over, with the president insisting them stay over for another day to visit the people and villages they knowed from their last time in Zambia. There was sure enough a warm welcome when they got there, and even a warmer send-off with a 21-gun salute when they boarded the plane was hired at the controls. Next stop, Perth, Australia. Well, Chapter 6. Well, after getting outfitted in Perth over a week, the group headed on out east to Southern Cross, 230 miles away. Jesse had put together a deal for close to 500,000 acres that included cattle and sheep ranches and natural gas wells, gold mines, and rare earth minerals. Jesse was figuring on the boys of building a processing plant that was said to take $1 billion investment and 8 years to build. Jesse was going to cut that time considerably, he said, but the cost was surely going to escalate, but the time factor would be cut to 3 years. With China cutting back on supplying the world rare earth minerals and the market suggesting it was time to take the plunge, said Jesse. There was some farming they got in the deal and other mining opportunities to be looked into as well, and it would take all of them to make this venture work. Part of the land was in the wheat belt, and wheat was a cash crop. Charlie and Steve was jumping up and down and biting at the bit to get started. Caroline and Sandra June didn't quite know what to make of all of it, but would go along with what was decided. Well, after meeting with the lawyers and owners of the properties they was buying, the deals was made and signed, and about $10 billion was spent, with another $5 billion for improvements added to the price tag. Jesse said that was chicken feed compared to what all they would make on this deal. They headquartered at the St. Patrick's Luxury Boutique Hotel in Garoit, which was about 2 miles from the Southern Cross. The hotel only advertised 5 bedrooms, but Buster made a deal with the owners for theirs too, so they could all stay together. The owners was fine folks and helped the group out in any way they could. Fact is, they was hired to guide them and show them the lay of the land whilst they was there. There was an airstrip right close by, and they hangared the Duchess there, as well as rented a helicopter and a small plane. It was a week before the boys got their bearings and really got into figuring out what all they was going to do to make this a really paying adventure. Within the month, businessmen and vendors from every which place was coming in and meeting with the group. Jesse was setting up meetings with all the different enterprises they was in, and to meet with all the management personnel and lead men. Also, he scheduled going on site to meet with the workers and get their temperature of being bought out by Americans. It was pretty much 100% approval from the workers and current management when all the boys and Charlie and Steve laid out their ideas in making changes and improvements or leaving things as they was. This was such a big undertaking that their stay was extended indefinitely. Of course, they would be going back home soon enough, but there wasn't no set time for it. Now, all the menfolk went in different directions and then paired up, sometimes, or all of them went together sometimes. They found out they had to hire more planes and helicopters and vehicles to get the ball rolling. It took about a month to get things lined out and operating smoothly. Some fellers was moved up within the company and some hired on. Butch was much better and would be coming over soon. Bulldog was on the mend, but it would take a good spell till he was ready to get back at it. Being bunged up didn't stop him none, though. Bulldog got him a team together and kept his secretary running. He had them all hard at it, I'm a-telling you. There was lots of legal matters to tend to, and Jesse and Bulldog lived on the computer and phone. Skype was worth its weight in gold. hired Walter along with Buster was working real close to the working men and come to be friends with some Peel were wrong aborigines in the area. Now Walter took to visit them in the evening about things like Julian talked about, told them stories of what had happened with him and the Cheyenne dog soldiers and medicine men. Well, Hired and the menfolk had a right smart understanding about animals, and they dearly respected his way with it. Well, Buster, dang it, just couldn't get the hang of a boomerang and give him a heck of a hoot about that. Buster was tougher than nails and stood up to all the tests they put him through to become a member of the tribe. Now, the Peel were wrong aborigines were self-sufficient, but every once in a while things went south for them as far as the government and their land. Now, Jesse intervened and either bought or give them the land that their people had lived on for centuries. All the boys give the tribesmen free rein on their holdings and passed the word along to all their managers and workers to let them be and let them take what they wanted. The Aborigines dearly respected and loved the boys, including Charlie and Steve, for not only what they did for them, but the men they was. Well, the women was having a ball. They went every which place and visited all the big cities and shopped all over Australia. They had plenty of time to do that since all the menfolk was gone a lot and spent a lot of time setting up the businesses and in meetings. The gals knowed that they all was worth more than anybody knowed, but that didn't go to their heads none. There just wasn't no finer women to be had. But in saying that, they sure could spend a pretty penny, but could squeeze one till it hollered too. The boys wanted their gals to be happy and enjoy the fruits of their labor. One thing all of them knowed was that it all come from the Lord, and they made sure they gave back about as much as they got. No wonder these here opportunities come to them, and they'd been blessed as they had. Now, Vivian Porter owns the St. Patrick's Luxury Boutique Hotel, and her parents, Don and Bill Clancy, are co-hosts for the hotel. Now, Vivian's brother Stephen Clancy and her mother Dawn are both qualified chefs who take care of their delicious cuisine. Well, they had to learn to eat what Buster wanted to eat too. One evening, Bill called all the ladies together and asked them if they would like to see the outback. He would take them on a little day trip to see a part of Australia they only see from the air or in a car. Well, all the gals was up for it and figured they'd leave out early the next morning. Now, all the women called their husbands and told them they was taking a day trip into the outback with Bill. Of course, all the boys told them just to have fun. Go ahead. Well, Dawn told them that when they got back, she was going to take them on a weekend trip to Sydney to the Opera House if they wanted to go. But now, all the gals could fly too. And Big Jim was a heck of a teacher. That's Hired Daddy, Big Jim Holmes. And sure enough, took a load off of the boys in doing that, I'm a-telling you. Well, Lulu told Caroline and Sandra June they was going to learn them both to fly too. Heck, fire them two was about to bust a gut getting so excited about that. You ain't going to hold them women down none at all, I'm here to tell you. Well, the next morning before it got too hot, Bill rounded up the gals and they headed on out. They was all excited and had lots of film for their cameras as well as their cell phone cameras too. Bill gave them all a brochure about the Great Victoria Desert and where they was going, and told them all about how it was and what they was getting into and what kind of critters was there and whatnot. Well, as Bill led the gals out into the desert, after they left the truck on the road, he explained all the different plant life and critters that they see. The rock formations was absolutely beautiful, said Lulu, and she took picture after picture. Well, all the gals were just mesmerized by the beauty of the desert. Bill also explained how dangerous the desert was too, and how the Peel were wrong aborigines lived off the land. Well, just as the group was headed back to the truck at exactly 10:24 a.m., a group of men come from out of nowhere and captured the women and beat down Bill but didn't kill him. The leader of the men was a huge feller, left a message with Bill to tell the boys that they had 72 hours to sign over all their assets of gold and the mines and claims, or they would start killing the women folk, one by one, till they did. The big feller also said to tell Buster that he wanted him to come for him and he would make sure it was just him and Buster, no holds barred. Well, that was the other condition for the release of the women. Then the men left on out with the women, leaving Bill to walk out the desert since they took his and keys. Now, Bill had another set of keys hid under the truck in a magnetic key holder box, and as hurting as he was, he drove like a bat out of hell to get to a phone to call the boys. He was lightning quick on that, you can believe it. Bill got a hold of the boys at 12:21 p.m. This was day one, and the clock was ticking. Chapter 7. Now, you talk about some fellers that had come plumb unglued, them 6 husbands was that. It was one thing when it was just them, but their women folk was another. Now, Jesse called Mr. Holmes immediately. Mr. Holmes said he had Dalton and Devane about 6 hours out, and Horace and Alfred was already in Perth. They touched down about an hour ago. Well, Horace and Alfred was talking with special ops from the Australian Army because of the intel they had received on the Illuminati. The special team had been assigned to specifically monitor the whereabouts and goings-on of the Illuminati, and any of their cohorts had found out about their movements to Western Australia and hightailed after them. Well, now, Dalton, Devane, Horace, and Alfred had requested that duty, and that was their first priority. Seeing as how they had all been in on the mix with that bunch, it only seemed right for them to hate up that special team. Of course, they liked the victuals these folks ate too, you know. They knowed more about them low-life Peckerwoods than anybody else except Mr. Holmes. The Presidential Corps was the only organization equipped to handle the Illuminati in any way, or any which way they had to. They was going to do something about them, and they did. Well, the boys were scattered all about their holdings and was meeting up back at the hotel as fast as they could get there. Oh boy, the first one back was Walter, and he was wall-eyed all about all this, and he went to the Duchess and began to gather up guns and equipment. Well, Buster come in then, and then Charlie and Steve. Hired and Jesse come in last, and everything was ready when they got there. Horace and Alfred come in by helicopter and was awaiting when Jesse and Hired showed up. They all got the skinny from Bill and didn't rightly know how they was going to be contacted, so somebody had to stay at the hotel just in case the Illuminati tried to reach them there at the hotel with further instructions. Buster and Charlie took a sat phone with them and lit out to where Bill said the gals was captured. Now, the rest of the boys waited to be contacted and for Dalton and Devane. Dalton and Devane come in, and Jesse said there ain't been no word as of yet. Well, Bill went through the whole story again, and then Dalton sent him on home to get better tended to and to rest up. Now, Bill didn't want to go, but they finally convinced him to go along with Don's insistence. He surely had some broke ribs and a broke nose and some broke fingers where he was warding off some of the blows to his hate. Old Bill was a toughin' and had several goose eggs on his noggin. The feller never complained a bit and was ready to go toe-to-toe with them scallywags. Well, Buster said he was going to take a chopper and head on out to where, Hired was going to take a chopper and head out to where Buster was checking on the site where the gals was captured. Walter, Jesse, and Steve stayed behind with the Presidential Corps boys to plan and wait for contact from the Illuminati. Well, Hired caught up with Buster and Charlie, and they searched as far as they could with the amount of fuel they had and then had to refuel. Now, old Charlie tweren't no slouch when it come to a shooting iron or a tussle neither. Charlie was a retired sheriff's deputy assigned to SWAT and the anti-terrorism unit. The boy could hold his own for sure. And them getting Cairo line didn't sit well with him. Them gals of the boys was tougher than wet leather too, but the fellers was right worried about them. They knowed the gals wouldn't give in none and would go down fighting. The women just couldn't beat the odds against them nor the weapons the kidnappers had. It seemed like the Illuminati was going to put their back up against the wall and wait till the last minute to make the boys sign over their gold claims and mine. It was going to be a war, because if the boys did sign over their gold, Mr. Holmes said he couldn't just let them get away with that. He knowed they was trying to control the world markets and take the freedom and independence away from all the countries they could. That's right, countries. If they had control of the markets, they controlled economies of most of the world, if not all of it. The United States had 8,300 tons of gold in reserves, and China had about 1,040 tons, and Switzerland had about 1,050. So with what all the boys had, the Illuminati could basically break the bank. The Illuminati could flood the market and devalue gold to whatever price the Illuminati wanted them to buy up all the reserves for a song or a cabbage on to all of the other gold and raise the price to whatever they wanted. So they basically do what they want with the economy of any country. Gold was the standard. Either way they win. Well, that just wasn't going to happen, said Dalton. Mr. Holmes had dedicated the entire presidential corps and all of its resources to wipe out the Illuminati. This wasn't just the United States, but the world we're talking about, said Devane. Well, meanwhile, whilst they was awaiting back at the hotel, Hired had refueled, and him and Buster and Charlie was still on the hunt for the kidnappers. Now, they reported back in at dark and told them all back at the hotel they hadn't had any luck and was going to pack it in for the night. Charlie said they would get an early start in the morning and continue the search. Well, the boys got up at first light. They wasn't going to burn no daylight, and all of them piled in the chopper and began to looking for the gals. As Hired got close to an outcropping of rocks and began to looking for a hiding place for the gals, a gunship come up from behind and began to firing on them. Well, the chopper Hired had rented wasn't no match for the gunship, and they was hit several times. The chopper started to go down, but Hired got her down behind a sand dune in a controlled crash. They was all bunged up a mite, but Charlie had broke his leg, and Buster and Howard had to drag him on out. Now, the helicopter was on fire, and Buster and Howard had to get out of there right fast before that chopper exploded. The boys got Charlie and dragged him down behind the next sand dune over when the chopper exploded. About that time, the gunship come back to make sure there weren't no survivors. Chapter 8. Well, Buster, Howard, and Charlie had hunkered down in a depression in the sand and waited till the gunship left on out. The boys knowed they was in a pickle for sure. No sat phone, no water, nor food, but was well heeled with weapons. They rested till morning, and then they was going to have to get on out of there and get help and save the gals. Buster said they was a burning daylight, and Howard went to the remains of the chopper to find what he could for a splint and a crutch for Charlie. The wreck had cooled off enough during the desert night so Howard could salvage the materials to fix up Charlie so they could start walking. Well, after fashioning a crutch and splinting Charlie's leg, they headed west. It was 5:36 a.m. on day 2. Well, Buster and Howard had been helping Charlie, and they was pretty near wore to a frazzle after 5 hours of hard walking in the sand. With no water, they was all parched to the bone. Well, Buster heard Howard tell Charlie just to hang on in there and they'd make it. Then Howard told Buster that they had to have water soon or they wasn't going to make it. Buster told Howard they had to make it. The gals was depending on them. This wasn't no desert like they had back in the States or one he'd been to before. Buster told Howard he knowed what direction to go in, but didn't know how to go about finding water out there. They walked another 2 hours and just had to stop. Between the heat and the load of toting Charlie, it was about doing them in. Charlie was a mite feverish now and needed water bad. Then out of nowhere come a band of the Peel-Wurrong Aborigines. There was also the people of the Kulin Nation. The these names here, Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung, the Tongarong and Dajah-Wurrong and the Watha-Wurrung, I don't know. A bunch of them now had gum Aborigines. They had lots of them, but they weren't in this area at the time. Them folks rambled the right smart, and the boys had met some of them during their stay in Australia. The Aborigines believe Bunjil, that's the eagle hawk, that's what that means, is the creator spirit of the land, the Lord, and his people. They respect people of the land and people that respect animals. Well, anyhow, the Aborigines got water for the boys and a bit of nourishment and sent word to where they was by way of the Aborigine telephone. And it's called a bull roar, and they flung that thing around and they knew what it meant, and that's how they communicated across these open spaces of the desert. Sometimes they'd get up on a high knoll or rock or something. The Aborigines just sort of faded away as Dalton, Devane, Jesse, and Walter, along with the special forces, found Buster, Howard, and Charlie. Now, after getting patched up some and tended to Charlie, Dalton told them that they found a cave where they were looking, and when their chopper was hit, and the gals was in there. Boy, if they knew I said that, they'd be mad, wouldn't they? Getting tongue-tied. If the day was ready, Dalton said they was going to begin the attack to get the gals. Buster and Howard said, let's go. Chapter 9. Now, folks, I told you I ain't no professional about all this and practice all this and all that. Wrote this mess, put it together, and the research, pictures, and all that stuff, but just reading it, that's what I do. You see what you get and get what you see. So if you wanted some professional person, some actor or something, well, you'd have to go get him, but I do this just to get a chuckle or just to kind of have some fun for you folks, and it's a little fun for me too, so anyway, I hope you appreciate that. Chapter 9. Devane set his dragonflies in first off. Them little devils could spy on you and you would never know it. They had a night vision capability built right into them for seeing in the dark, and it sure was dark in that cave. The dragonflies could also be lethal. Devane would keep 4 of them to protect the gals if they couldn't get them to them in time, and he would have 3 of them to surveil and recon the interior of the cave. The rest of the dozen Devane had with him would be on the lookout for other forces that may be in the area and the gunship that shot down our chopper. The Special Forces boys would be there when they got there and take care of the ones that was left standing or jump in and help with the fight if it was still going on. The plan was to attack from the top of the cave as well as direct assault. The fellers dropping covertly from the top would take out as many of the entrance guards as possible, whilst the rest of the team would lay in wait to see what all happened. Now, part of this attack depended on just how it played out, even though Dalton and the boys considered a contingency plan. It was going to be dicey, no doubt. As Dalton and the team began to move in, the gunship come into view and started to strafe the top of the escarpment where their cave was located. The gunship was trying to take out the men that was trying to drop in from the top. The men was pinned down, and Dalton and the team began to take fire from the cave. The fat was in the fire, I'm telling you. Now, from out of nowhere come a missile and destroyed the gunship. It was destroyed by a drone that was deployed by the Australian Army. It was high overhead and could not be detected by ground forces or the gunship. It was history. The men at the top of the cave that was set to rappel down to the entrance was in a pickle since they couldn't catch the kidnappers by surprise. Dalton signaled to them to stay put till he told them to attack. A dragonfly was equipped with a device that had a chemical that ate through plastic but would not harm human flesh. Devane put it right between Lou Ann and Sandra June. They was the limberest of all the gals and could twist up to where they could get the chemical from the dragonfly and get the plastic cups off of them. Once one of the women was free, she would turn the rest of them loose. One of the kidnappers seen what was going on and turned to shoot Sandra June. Devane had a dragonfly detonate right in the feller's eyeball and killed him straight off. By that time, Lulu was freed up. Another feller, the one that had tasered her, come over to help out. Well, he sure met his match, caught him off guard, and he pert near swallowed his tongue when Lulu put 2 fingers in his chest. He went down like a ton of bricks. It was a move she had learned from the Israeli Mossad. She got that training in Chicago whilst flight attendants was taught to defend and incapacitate the terrorists. That anti-terrorist training sure enough paid off, and that's a fact. Of course, that's what she used to do, fly for the airline. Well, all the women folk was freed by this time, and Devane kept an eye on them to make sure they weren't going to be harmed none. He had 2 more dragonflies watching over. Now, Dalton signaled the team at the top to come in and firing, but not to shoot the gals. The kidnappers was too occupied with the attack to worry about the women at this time. The 2-prong attack worked like a charm, but the fighting was pretty fierce now. What Dalton and Devane didn't know was that there was side tunnels in the cave and another dozen men in them were waiting for the attackers to come into the cave so they could surprise them and wipe them out. About the time all the team got into the entrance of the cave to where they could be ambushed, cries could be heard from the interior. Seemed like them kidnappers just didn't figure on the peel were wrong, knowing a little more than they did about this here land. There was an entrance that was unknown to the kidnappers, and William led the Special Forces boys into where the kidnappers were going to ambush the team. They didn't laugh till the water got hot. The boys run in to get the wives, and the fight was over for the most part. The women had picked up all manner of weapons and been a-shooting and a-fighting too. Now, that red-headed gal at Charlie's Cairo line was madder'n a wet hen and was beating the tar out of a feller. Charlie told her to hold up, but she said he's got a whooping coming. He took too many liberties with the gals, but especially with me, and he's gonna pay for it. Well, after a few teeth was knocked out and a few knots put on his and hay, Charlie pulled her off of him. Kinda hard to do with his leg in his splint toe. Of course, Sandra June, oh, that gal. Of course, Sandra June continued to give all of them what for, and one feller said to take him to jail, anything to hush her up. Steve just laughed and said he'd been hearing that for 35 years. Well, all the boys got in their licks as well as the gals, but it weren't no cakewalk. There was wounded and dead on both sides, but mainly dead for the kidnappers. Probably 4 or 5 was still alive when Buster left, and they was in for a big surprise with Devane interrogating them, I'm telling you. Buster heard his name called and looked up at the top of the escarpment, and there was this feller that was pretty near big as a barn. He had Lulu and was going to throw her off of the cliff. He told Buster to come on up if he wanted her to live. Buster told the man to let her loose. If he was waiting on him, he was backing up. The man said if Buster won the fight, she lives, but if he lost, they was both dead. Buster told him that's fine by him. He was on his way up there. Well, Lulu was trussed up like a Christmas turkey and no way to get free. She was left hanging out over the edge of the cliff from a rope, and all it took was one slice of a sharp knife to send her to her death. Now, Buster met the gorilla man head on. Buster was 6'4" and a solid 255 pounds, as quick as a cat for a big man. But Buster's strength wasn't only in his arms, but in his legs. That boy could leg press over 1,000 pounds 300 times. He even broke one of them weight machines with all the weight you could pile on it. He even bit the handles plumb off of the thing, too. Buster could lift cars and do all other manner of feats of strength. Well, Buster was a lot to handle now. Well, the big feller wasn't no slouch. And he's about 6'9", run about 350 pounds. He sure looked solid as a rock, too. Now, they went at each other tooth and toenail. The big feller took a lick from Buster, that fella Ox, but kept on a-coming. Buster stood toe-to-toe with the big feller and took a few good licks, too. They was both bloody. Seemed like both of them knowed a little about hand-to-hand in the martial arts, too. One thing Buster knowed, if he could ever get his hands on the big feller, he was his'n. Buster would hang on like a pit bulldog. You had to hand it to the big feller, though. He was much of a man and stout as an ornery cuss, too. The big feller just took a whooping from Buster, but got the upper hand on Buster when Buster slipped and went to a knee. That big feller would have killed an ordinary man when he hit Buster with a haymaker. Took Buster to the ground, but he was up on his feet before the big feller could stomp him. The big feller got Buster in a headlock and was choking him down when Buster reached back and got a handful of hair and pert near yanked the big feller's head off. Buster got him off balance enough to get loose. Both men was breathing hard, and they backed off from each other and then run together like they was a-hugging. Now, Buster was quicker than the big feller, and in the boy's mind a whole lot stouter. Of course, that remained to be seen. Well, both men come face to face and got each other in a bear hug. Something had to give. Well, Buster got to where he was about to pass out with the pressure on his lungs from the squeezing the big feller was putting on him. Then all of a sudden, Buster went limp and dropped down just enough to get up under the big feller's ribs. Then Buster went to town on that big feller, I'm a-telling you. Heck, fire, that big feller looked like his eyeballs were going to pop right out of his head. Buster give a mighty heave, and the big feller dropped like a sack of taters. Buster backed up, catches and wind, and then he thought the big feller was done for. Before Buster could get to him, the big feller crawled over to where Lulu was a-hanging and pulled out his knife and cut the rope she was hanging from. Well, Buster went hog wild. He grabbed a hold of that big feller and lifted him over his head and then dropped him over his knee, breaking his back. Buster made a beeline to the edge of the cliff to see about Lulu. Danged if she wasn't held up by William. William said Mungill let her live and let him help save her. He give the end of the rope to Buster, and he pulled her back up. Well, Buster cut her loose, and she hugged him up good and proper, kissing him like there wasn't no tomorrow. When Buster looked down over the cliff, William was gone. A mystery for sure, but not the believers. Buster went over and asked the big feller his name before he died. The big feller said he was the brother of Heinrich Meyer. Wilhelm was his name, and said he should have killed Buster for what he done to his brother. Well, Buster told him they both deserve everything they got for the terrible things they done to folks. Then Wilhelm went to hell. The didgeridoo, or Uraki as some Aborigines called it, played a melody that took the far pain and stress of the day away as the band of Peel Rurong faded in the distance of the desert evening. Between the Presidential Corps and Australian Special Forces, the killing ground was cleared up and most of the evidence of the battle was removed. The Army would send in a team for more cleanup in the morning to leave the land as near as it was before the battle. Respect of the land and the Aboriginal way of life was the will of the people who lived in Australia, as it should be. The boys and their women folk got back to their hotel where there was a feast awaiting for them and congratulations for the safe return of the women. Bill was there and hugged each one of the women and asked them to forgive him for not doing more to help them. Well, all the gals told him he was their hero for doing what he done and bringing help, and they would never forget it. Well, Jesse called Mr. Holmes and had a heart-to-heart talk with him about the fracas and Illuminati. Well, Mr. Hiram said he reckoned they was on the run now, but to always keep an eye out for them to pop up at any time. Well, Jesse told Mr. Holmes they was going to rest up for a few days and complete some business and then head on out for the house and would keep him posted. Well, Dalton, Devane, Horace, and Alfred stayed right near till the boys left back to the States, but enjoyed their time with the boys and their wives whilst they had a chance. They was all dear friends by now and cared deeply for each other. They'd been through so much together. Dalton asked what was in their plans when they got back, and Jesse said they was going to stop by Kentucky on the way back. Kind of a long way around, but they hadn't been there in a while, and Jesse said the women would enjoy the visit for a day or two, and it would get their minds off the kidnapping. Well, Jesse and Buster called Walter and Hire and said, "What do y'all think about taking this crew back with us to Kentucky?" Well, all of them said if they didn't go along with them, Buster would sit on them and they would have to listen to his singing. "That'd be torture for sure," said Devane, and the four of them went in and said in unison, "We're going." Well, Mr. Holmes told Walter when he called to tell him they was going to do that, he appreciated the free ride for the men and it saved him money. More money for his and Seaguard, said Hire, and they all laughed on that one. Well, Chapter 10. 4 days later, after all the details was cleared up over the kidnapping and business was concluded for the boys, they left out for the house. Aunt Judith had died a few years back, and she was buried in the family cemetery on the farm. Maureen had passed as well, and that just left Colleen, and she was ailing for quite a spell. Colleen was the youngest of the two, and she was 102 when she passed on. The husbands of the McBrayer gals was brung to the farm and buried there with Maureen and Colleen in the family plots. Maureen and Colleen had a place beside their husbands when they passed, and the boys flew the McGregors from Scotland for the funerals. The McGregor gals didn't want to be far from their home here on the farm or Aunt Judith, so they was laid to rest right there where they wanted to be. Now, Elizabeth Jane and Bo was back and forth from Savannah taking care of the mansion and the distillery, but with their life as it was with two young'uns to raise and business matters to tend to, it was right hard on them. Well, Jesse and the boys had a reason to go to Kentucky, and Elizabeth Jane and Bo was going to meet them there for a couple of days before they had to get on back to Savannah. Bo's folks was tending to the grandkids till they got back, and it was a pleasure to get to theirselves for a spell. When the group landed and drove into the mansion at McBrayer Springs, they was welcomed by Elizabeth Jane and Bo. There was old McBrayer aplenty, and the feed bag was full for sure. Not like when the McGregor gals and Aunt Judith was alive, but good nonetheless. That first evening after supper, Buster asked everybody to join him in the parlor. They all remembered the good times with Aunt Judith there, and the boys especially remembered the first time they laid eyes on her. Such good memories. Anyhow, Aunt Judith got her wish and got all the boys' family roots traced back and found that all the boys was kin. Some closer than others, but still kin. All the boys shared in everything in business. That didn't change none after Aunt Judith passed as far as the farm and distillery and the investments was concerned. Jesse said to Elizabeth Jane that all the boys knowed how hard it was on her and Bo try to run the farm and the distillery, so they had a proposition for him. Since they all knowed each other, and that included Charlie and Caroline and Steve and Sandra June, they had a plan for them to stay in Savannah and just come when they wanted to. Steve and Sandra June loved the place, and Steve was another MacGyver when it come to try to figuring and fix it. He was going to run and manage the distillery and the farm, and Sandra June would see to the mansion. Their two young'uns was growed and gone, and they wanted to change their way of life. Well, Elizabeth Jane just jumped for joy and hugged Sandra June and Steve, and Bo shook Steve's hand and said he would fill him in on anything he needed to know. The boys and the gals filled Bo and Elizabeth Jane in on what all happened in Australia and cautioned them about the Illuminati and what Mr. Holmes said, as well as about keeping an eye out. Now, Elizabeth Jane asked if they would ever be rid of the Illuminati, the most evil and vile criminals in the world. Walter said that Dalton would be the one best suited to answer that question, so Dalton gave him a rundown on what all the Presidential Corps was a-doing to wipe out the Illuminati off the face of the earth. Devane didn't say much, but Horace and Alfred put in their 2 cents worth for sure. Well, Howard said they was going to stay for 2 more days and leave. Steve and Sandra June would stay behind and begin to run operations. It was a happy time for them all that evening. They was all glad things were getting back to normal, and after a little more old McBrayer and a toast to Aunt Judith and McGregor's, they all turned in for the night. The next morning, Elizabeth Jane was taking a stroll down by the stream when a hand-picked team of the Illuminati took her. There was a dozen of them, again, just like in Australia. Elizabeth Jane screamed, and Monique heard her while she was a-coming for her breakfast. Monique seed the men toting her off up the hill and run to the house a-hollering for Jessie. Well, Devane was the first to meet her at the house, and she told him and the others as they come up what all she see. Well, all the menfolk grabbed their guns and lit on out after the fellers. They caught up with them at the cemetery, and there is where it hit the fan. There was shooting all right, but it finally come down to hand like it always done. Now, several of the Illuminati was hunkered down by gravestones, and others of them by trees, and the fighting was sure enough intense. Now, Charlie got nicked by some knife-throwing feller when his machine gun jammed. Steve and Horace was side by side, and a burst got Steve in the thigh and Horace in the side, but not serious enough to stop him. Devane was a whirling dervish and took out 4 of them so fast it'd make your head swim. He picked them off like shooting fish in a barrel. Now, them fellers was good too now. Alfred got it good, but wasn't dead, but hurt bad. Dalton was on to them burrheads like a duck on a June bug, and done what for to them in no time flat. Well, Jessie and Howard had a bunch of them pinned down from high ground, but they wouldn't give up. Bo was a-looking for where they had Elizabeth Jane help, but didn't see her right off. Well, Buster and Walter had come around from the back and had them braced so they'd had to give up. All in all, it was pretty short and sweet, and the women folk had called for help and was tending their men. Well, after the rest of the Illuminati throwed down their guns was rounded up in a group, the boys figured it was over, but this here one feller made to get in the fray by pulling a Gurkha knife and went after Jessie. Well, that got the ball a-rolling, I'm a-telling you. Old Jessie was a sleeper if there ever was one. He just happened to be the smallest of all the boys, but he was like fighting a circle saw. Jessie had learned all manner of that hand-to-hand fighting through the years and knowed some stuff taught to him by an old Chinese master he got to know when he helped him out in a business deal that went bad for the monastery. It was his gift to Jessie. The villain got more than he bargained for her, that's for sure. Monique was all agog when Jessie went to push hands and knocked that feller against a tree without even touching him. Rattled his cage something fierce. Now, when the feller fluttered his eyeballs, Jessie was standing over him and didn't give no mercy on the feller. Jessie muttered something about he was sick and tired of people trying to kill him, and then he put a move on the man so fast the body couldn't see it with the naked eye. They heard a bit of a moan or a sigh, and the man was deader than a doorknob. Well, just about when the hand-to-hand fighting was over, Bo spied the feller by the big monument in the graveyard and began to run up to him. The man stood up with Elizabeth Jane and was holding a gun to her head. Now, Elizabeth Jane yelled to Bo that it was him. The him was none other than Collins Amschel Freeman. And everybody knowed who that was. Man, he was the feller that courted Elizabeth Jane over in England and was the heir apparent to lead the Illuminati. Collins said, "Well, if it isn't Beau Armand Senier, I finally get to kill two birds with one stone. What a pleasure." Well, Freeman told all the boys to drop their guns and to huddle up or he would kill Elizabeth Jane and Beau. Well, Buster made a move towards Collins and Collins shot him in the shoulder. But that gave Devane time to slip up to the side of Collins and give him a good whack to his arm and caused him to drop the gun. Then old Beau was on him. Now old Beau knowed a thing or two himself. He knows savant being French trained and all. Beau laid into Collins with a vengeance. Elizabeth Jane had got away and the boys got their guns and corralled the bad ones to help some. Until that help come up and help the rest of them get everybody patched up and back, get attended medical and whatnot. The boys had them all trussed up and ready to be hauled off when the authorities got there. Devane said the Illuminati men would be taken to his secure facility for interrogation as per Mr. Holmes. We know what that's about. Take no prisoners. Them fellas wasn't going to see the light of day again unless there was a huge exception, but it was a sure enough fact they was going to tell all they know. Beau put a whooping on old Collins and then he broke loose and hit the ground running. He went straight for the mansion. Beau caught up with Collins in the parlor with Jesse and Walter right behind him. Buster and the others being tended to, so they wasn't there when the fireworks started. There was a pair of swords, eppies they was called, hanging over the mantel that was used by some of the family during the war, and Collins went for them. Beau run up against Collins and managed to get himself one of the eppies, and the duel was on. Beau had been a fencing all his life since he was just a toddler big enough to hold one up. Old Collins was good too, but no match for Beau. Both them men was a bleeding and cut up a mite, but old Collins had the worst of it. Collins was a hollering all manner of nonsense and that he was going to kill Beau and Elizabeth Jane. He said that the Illuminati would rule the world soon and he would be the leader. He also said that the boys had done enough damage to their cause and killed his family. Well, sir, the duel was something to see in a real life or death fight. About the time Collins was coming in for a thrust, Beau sidestepped him and went to one knee and put his blade plumb through the heart of old Collins. As Collins was a-dying, he said it ain't over yet. All the wounded was patched up, and the ones that needed the hospital to care for them was took there till they healed up some. Dalton and Devane, as well as Horace and Alfred, was staying till Mr. Holmes got there. He had told Dalton to keep an eye out till he come and had a meeting with all of them. He said he'd be there in about a week when everybody was well enough to talk. Chapter 11. Now, Mr. Holmes flew in and met with the boys and the women, and with his and men there too. Mr. Holmes said he was permanently assigning Dalton, Devane, Horace, and Alfred to the boys and their wives and families. Additional manpower and resources would be available to them for the boys on an immediate and priority basis when they called for it. Just holler. The special team for the Illuminati would be increased and more resources available to it as well. Mr. Holmes will be the control for the Illuminati unit. Folks was getting back to normal again. There had been just too much fighting and a killing, but reality was reality and the boys didn't ask for none of it. Steve was on the mend and Buster's shoulders were just creased a mite and he was going full speed, but Lulu said it was a mite tender though. Charlie had him 4 stitches and Caroline was taking good care of him. They was set to go back to Australia for an extended time after they tended to some business and family matters back home before they left on out. Charlie was going to run all the business holdings there in Australia. Horace had the worst of it, but his gunshot in his side didn't hit nothing vital, and he was well on his way to healing up. He was going to stay with Sandra June and Steve for a spell till everything calmed down. Mr. Holmes insisted on that. Now, Horace was looking forward to Sandra June's fried taters and sweet tea. Oh, Buster said he could eat his and wait in them, and she cooked them so good. She'd always make 2 skillets full of fried taters when Buster was there. One for him and one for them, and Buster would eat part of theirs. Well, Horace told her not to change a thing on his account. He could eat a skillet full too. Well, the boys and the gals took off in the Dutchess with Dalton and Devane with them going back home. Alfred went back to Washington to get things settled with Mr. Holmes about the Illuminati unit and their duties assigned to the boys. Jesse and Monique let Howard and Walter off along with Dalton at the house. Jesse, Monique, Buster, Lulu, and Devane continued to New Orleans to let Monique see her folks for a couple of days before they went on back home. Well, on the way, Jesse and Buster stopped over in Mountain Brook to see some of Jesse's friends and people, then winged their way up to Montgomery to sign some papers on their deals in Australia. Jesse had received a call from one of the companies that was selling them, and their secretary said if it was okay, they'd meet up for supper and then sign the documents. Something was overlooked when they was there, she said. Well, Jesse said that'd be fine since they was in the area. They was to meet at the Vintage Year Steakhouse at 405 Cloverdale Road there in Montgomery. Whilst Dalton and Buster got the Duchess ready to leave for supper, Jesse had a limo come to pick them up and take them to the restaurant. Well, all of them piled into the limo and headed on out to meet up with the company men and their lawyer to sign the papers and eat a good meal. Well, everybody was in fine feather and good spirits as they drove to the entrance to be let out. Well, just as Jesse and Monique got out the car, gunshots rang out and hit Jesse in the chest and just missed Monique. Monique had turned to pick up her purse off of the seat as the shots was fired, and the bullet went through her evening wrap and didn't hit her. Well, everybody ducked and got to cover, but Jesse was down on the ground with Monique covering him with her body. Monique saw the person come around the front of the limo to shoot her and Jesse again, and she leaped on that lone gunman like a dadgum chicken on a June bug. In the meantime, whilst this was going on, Dalton heard a helicopter start its engines about a block and a half away and asked if Buster could handle it here whilst he stopped the getaway. There was definitely somebody else in on this and he had to stop him. Buster said he would and grabbed his .45 caliber Desert Eagle and sent the shooter scurrying for cover with Monique dead on her heels. Dalton got to the ball field at Finley Curve and pulled the woman out the helicopter that was the pilot. She was a-fighting like a she-cat, but no match for Dalton. Dalton put her out with a pressure point to a nerve and then shut down the chopper. Well, Dalton called in reinforcements as he raced back to the restaurant. About when Dalton got back to the restaurant, Monique had tackled the shooter. They was a-fighting something fierce. Now, the hooded gunmen had their hands full with a wife that just seen her husband shot. Monique put a roundhouse kick to the head of the gunman that knocked him deader than a wedge. Jesse come up right then and hugged up Monique. When she seed him, she began to squalling. She thought Jesse was done for dead. She blubbered that she just didn't think she would ever see him again. Well, Jesse told her he had on his bulletproof vest and the gunman was sure enough a good shot. Got him right over the heart. Purity knocked him for a loop. Well, Jesse shoved Monique to the side when the gunman pulled out a hideout pistol from an ankle holster and fired. The shot hit the vest that Jesse was a-holding, and Monique run at the gunman and grabbed him around the neck and pulled off the hood. The gunman broke free and Jesse stood there purely amazed and dazed when the gunman said they was going to kill him and Monique a man-stealer. Man-stealer? Whew! The gunman was none other than Janice from Selma, Alabama. She was the black-headed gal that had her sights set for Jesse in college. She tried to get her hooks into Jesse, but Buster and the boys see to that wasn't going to happen. It was over before the water got hot after the boys got some sense back into Jesse's head. Well, Monique struggled with Janice and then the pistol went off. Well, Janice backed off and fell to her knees with blood coming from her mouth and the wound in her chest. As she was a-dying, Janice said, "I should have killed you when I had the chance, Jesse. Klaus will see to you." Then she fell over on her face, dead as a mackerel. Well, Janice always had an evil streak in her, and her sisters did too, except the little one that wasn't bad turned her life around. Them other two went to the dark side, and Janice held a grudge against Jesse for all those years and blamed Monique for her troubles where she couldn't get Jesse. It was all about the money, you know. Reckon it was them pheromones of his'n that done her in this time. Her sister was the pilot of the chopper. Dalton heard the name Klaus and reported to Mr. Holmes right on the spot. he told Mr. Holmes that he would bet that she had ties to the Illuminati. Now, not that Janice was part of the family, but they used her hatred for their own purposes. Mr. Holmes agreed to that. Jessie and Buster and the gals flew back home that evening with Dalton sitting in the left seat. It was a little too much, the gal said, but we got to be strong and deal with this evil bunch, don't we? Man, it's something every time we turn around, said Lulu. Well, Jessie and Buster and the gals flew back home that evening with Dalton sitting in the left seat, like I said. And they told their wives they loved them and would do everything in their power to protect them. They all agreed that they was really lucky and blessed to have each other, and they had right on their side. Measures was being taken to see that no more surprises was going to happen to the boys and their families. Mr. Holmes felt it was his responsibility for ever getting the boys into all this those years ago when they was just youngins. Well, Dalton, Devane, Horace, and Alfred was professionals and chose this way of life to live, but the boys didn't. They was patriots and come from good stock and would never run from a fight. Now, Mr. Holmes swore if anybody ever harmed a hair on any of the boys' heads, that they could only wish they was dead. Dalton and Devane especially would see to that, but Mr. Holmes would do the honors himself. Well, finally everything did settle down for a spell, and after 2 years and 47 days, a grand party was held again at the mansion in Kentucky. There was young'uns and a new generation to take the place of the old coming on. The years was good to the boys and their families, and peace was in their homes. A friend from out of town come to the party. Said he knowed the boys some dealings in Europe and stopped by to say hello. His name was Klaus. Well, folks, till the next time and another story, y'all have a blessed day. This is old Buster signing out. See you later.